Okay, what happened this week in macro? Right. So there was basically a big drawdown in people that were trying to get gold out of the Bank of England, those that were custodying gold with the Bank of England, that also has these sub-networks and derivatives of paper version of gold, which many people believe that the paper version is not backed by gold because that was a scam of the proof of weapons network that got the fractional reserve system legalized in order to have a nice scheme with governments where you could enslave them and indebt them, and then that could be used in order to invest in war so that you could then take your companies and make sure their share price increased through war, death, and destruction. That was the Bank of England model. And now there is an exodus of gold away from the Bank of England. And people are questioning, are the gold reserves there? So those that were trying to get their gold out were explaining, and I won't go too deep into this, but there was a 6-week delay being told to them in order to receive their gold. Wouldn't it be great if there was an asset class where you could see on chain, it was completely auditable, and you didn't need a counterparty in order to prove those reserves? Well, we created a digital version of that called Bitcoin. But we're seeing some of the challenges with the legacy system, gold, which is a hedge against Bitcoin failure. I still believe in physicality under set circumstance, but we are seeing the weakness of that as well. 6-week delay. Remember, during the lockdowns, people could not get their physical gold when they were requesting it because all the systems broke down, and suddenly it's all in Singapore, it's all in London, it's all in Texas, it's all in Switzerland, and you don't know whether it's there or not. But I think you can safely say that if they need 6 weeks in order to give you that gold, they're probably scrambling to buy it. And if the price of gold is going to new all-time highs as it approaches almost $3,000 now, you can bet your bottom dollar that the Bank of England is empty. And do we get to audit the Fed and follow the same model that we got with USAID, which is expose the corruption, audit it, and shut this shit down? Well, it's a bigger mission, but we've already proven the model. But they're probably waiting for the stablecoin regulations and alternative system all to come, I believe, in the Trump administration. So gold starts to hit a new all-time high. And gold is being repatriated away from the European Union over to the US. And of course, those at BRICS have been accumulating it all along with China, Russia, various other jurisdictions that need apolitically neutral. Anyone that has been sanctioned needs their Bitcoin, their gold stacks. And I believe that they're going to be repurposing their energy towards Bitcoin. And many people are doing that anyway. You find out that the emperor has no clothes, and the power structures are all built upon a web of lives, a web of debt, and eventually, as the tide goes down, you realize they're completely naked and have no power. And that is what Bitcoin gives to us. And so what is happening in the macro environment? Essentially, the US, as I explained last week in Bitcoin Hard Talk, is moving towards a deliberate policy to weaken the dollar, which means that we need to say that we are strong right now as we move to nationalism under the MAGA movement, because we want to peacefully weaken the dollar so that we can build our manufacturing base, because we are no longer a global power. Now that China has won that side of the region, BRICS has reunified around a global south. And the region within the Middle East can't be toppled and destabled by these covert operations because USAID has revealed the whole scam. And so we now have to engage in diplomacy and negotiate and accept that there will be a power structure within Europe, the Middle East, and BRICS around the global south, centered around China, as America becomes America first, unwinds the proof of weapons network, and hopefully ends the Fed, or at least builds the tools to end the Fed. And you can reverse all of the damage that was done that was created this whole Ponzi scheme in the first place. So America has a ginormous budget deficit. And so by implementing tariffs, it is moving towards, like a company that's in bankruptcy, eliminating all the costs, implementing focus on increasing revenue and decreasing the deficit. But decreasing the deficit cannot has to coincide with a massive contraction in GDP, a recession and depression, unless you get monetary reform, which is why I think the crypto capital of the world, Bitcoin strategic reserves, is essential in order to manage that peaceful transition, as probably the BRICS corridor recognize that you can use Bitcoin as well. And the whole world starts to recognize that, and you can front run through these macro trends that we are experiencing. So I am certain right now that this is a way of recognizing that America is now a superpower region rather than global police for the world. And that is why we are negotiating with BRICS and Russia right now, recognizing that the proxy war didn't win. America went broke. The middle class got wiped out. The suicide rates are higher than ever. People went crazy with these woke regimes. It went to a populist movement to the right. We had this immigration, deep state initiatives that are driving people further and further apart, that led to more and more wealth inequality. And then that export and blew up the entire world. There is no middle class. And now you need to retreat and recognize that the dollar is absolutely predatory to the world unless we restructure it, go America first, and recognize that before we go to World War III, we are a regional power, and there are multiple regional powers around the world, and we can no longer police. So we need USAID, expose it for what it is as we retreat. And then there are forces that want to drive America into World War III, as we are seeing with the desire to try and get America to occupy Gaza so that they can trigger another war and force a regime change in Iran, another forever war that will be worse and worse. We'll go through that in the geopolitical section, but let's stick to the macro trends in order to prop up the petrodollar. This is a retreat away from the petrodollar by focusing on America having its own energy, its own oil, its own rare earths, its own semiconductor manufacturing base. Tariffs is the way to do it without you looking like you're retreating and you're no longer a superpower, which is what would have happened if you carried on to fight Russia. And if you turn this into a rapid escalation, the whole thing would have been a disaster for everybody. So tariffs is focusing on bringing in new income and giving the Trump administration negotiation power so that it can drive more exports, so that it can rebuild its manufacturing base. But there is a price to that, and that is rampant inflation. And that's why I believe that it has to be mixed with a monetary reform in order to transition out of it peacefully. But the Fed ain't going to give up power until America's destroyed. And then they go, which is why why you got to recognize that the Fed is a globalist, not an America first. You know, BlackRock is a globalist, not America first. The banks are globalists, not America first. And so if you want an America first monetary policy, you need the reforms, which is what we are going through in this interesting time in the macro environment. So you will need a monetary reform as the world moves to world reserve currencies not being one homogenous power that uses terrorism and covert weaponry in order to destroy, kill, and massacre people, as it happened in the post-World War II era, using organizations like USAID and many of the others. Don't forget, no one's talking about the National Endowment of Democracy, NED. Go have a look at that institution. That's the one that makes you think you're exporting democracy when you're replacing any shot of democracy with dictators through colored revolutions, through funding terrorism, and through overthrowing and toppling in order to have violence that props up the world reserve currency and gets that massive deficit that's imploding on itself right now. So what is the extent of it in the macro side? So at the moment, America is running this year or last year a $2.1 trillion deficit. So to get that back to a surplus, you got to find $2.1 trillion of additional revenue, which is essentially a contraction of the economy because the dollar is debt. Debt is dollar, which is why world reserve currency requires deficit spending, government debt, corporate debt, and individual debt propped up by real estate. So to balance that budget, it would require cutting debt of $2 trillion in spending. Now, remember, the $250 trillion of liabilities on top of the $37 trillion of debt is all war, military industrial complex, interest on debt, Medicare, Social Security. So only through pension reform can you achieve that goal, which means potentially defaulting and moving to a new model, hence the Bitcoin strategic reserves and creative structuring that can happen in America as we go through this correction in GDP that are required, because without it, it would be like the global financial crisis. Again, those types of numbers. So this is what we are experiencing right now. This is why people need to protect themselves with Bitcoin and not fall for the tricks of crashing Bitcoin, making you sell your Bitcoin to those that are buying it, which are the hedge funds, which are manipulating the price short term. Okay. Right. So in these tariff wars, we haven't had any in Mexico yet. We just had a reciprocal agreement. So we haven't had any in Mexico. Those are your neighbors for the nationalist policy in order to be the regional power. But the real one is on China, because it is about trying to weaken China. You lost the last trade war. And that is what drove more and more people from the global south into working with China. The Belt and Road Initiative didn't topple any governments. And so while they are lending people, they have a business model that's different to America. They're investing in growing the economy rather than controlling the government, regardless of their economic model, which is driving more people to want to go to China. And so if you are South Africa and you're being targeted by the proof of weapons network, and they're pretending that your internal issues are things that they're trying to solve, you need to retreat and you need to say, well, where am I going to get that money from now? I'm going to go with the country that's going to rebuild my economy rather than exploit my economy and use blood diamonds and various other things, which are Israel policies to prop up De Beers and various other things, as was revealed in those movies, if you haven't watched them. Well, anyway, China's saying it's going to reverse with a 15% tariff, and we're going to enter into trade wars. But before doing that, it went into a complaint to the World Trade Organization at the same time as America retreating from these organizations. And so that gets to lead to more exposure of corruption. So we're getting this mass exposure of corruption in order to peacefully be able to retreat. So America can say, we are still powerful, and we get to move to this AI type of world where everyone focuses on energy and electric vehicles and everything that essentially China and America are focusing on right now, with two different models. One with a state banking system, the other with a Federal Reserve proof of weapons network that transfers all the wealth over to the shareholders of the Federal Reserve and the recipients of lobby money like the military industrial complex and big pharma. Anyway, so Trump decided the next stage is to impose this week a 25% tariff on, in England, we say aluminium. I don't live in England, but I'm still British. You say aluminum and steel imports. So that was the next target, which is a corporate level target rather than a country level. We will see the impact of that. The largest exporter of aluminium, I'll say, and steel to America is who? Canada. And so that impacts Canada. And we are still preparing for the reaction to the European Union, which is why we had all of these NATO battles next. And I hope and pray that this strategy is going to be used on NATO, because that is another USAID that is killing so many people in the eyes of pretending to, be a European first policy of not working with Russia that wanted to join NATO, and instead servicing the profits of America's military industrial complex by expanding NATO to create aggression and then scam people and countries into spending more and more and more on America, which is driving the euro dollar demand that was having all this inbound investment in order to prop up the dollar and its deficit that was causing more wealth inequality in America, and having the European Central Bank take over all those currencies to have a Fed first policy and destroy the base of the European people. So what will happen in the tariff war with the European Union? I think it will drive people to, if we can expose the scam of the Ukrainian war, which was a NATO operation, in order to drive more profits and collateralize the land, and get those loans so that BlackRock and the globalist organizations can benefit from it and benefit from the killings, then the tariff war might drive a reunification between Europe and BRICS, so that we can have, Russia is this BRICS corridor between China, Europe, and we can have the Middle Eastern bloc between America and China as well. So hopefully we're going to do that instead of World War III, but we shall see. But Europe is showing that they're a America first, which is what got them into this war in the first place. Instead, they should look at BRICS type of policy, look after yourself, and that could be exerted through tariff wars. And America could get to say, well, okay, then we'll have huge import taxes, which will bankrupt Europe. You can't say Europe spend more with us. You can't say Europe buy more gas from us. You can't say we'll charge more tariffs. And we're going to be strengthening your currency relative to ours is one way of managing that transition. So we will see what happens within all these wars, these currency wars, and we'll keep doing that. But one thing I do agree with is reciprocal tariffs. So Trump announced his favorite policy. It was part of the last administration, reciprocal tariffs, which just simply says, if you tariff us, we'll tariff you. Who is impacted by that the most? India. 17% of the 17% tariffs charged by America, by India. And so we had the meeting between Modi and Trump, and he was in there yesterday, and they were making their announcement. And of course, that follows up by these reciprocal tariffs leads to America being able to build its manufacturing base through export of gas and oil, by India buying more of it. And so you get, because of these reciprocal tariffs, so you get these executive orders, and India announced that it's going to be buying more natural gas, LNG, from US, as well as Russia, Saudi, and Iraq, which is where it was getting it all from. And remember, that was the scam. The scam was support India's economy by sanctioning Russia, blowing up the gas pipes through the CIA, and then just making it where the cheap oil goes to India. Russia sells it to India, and then India sells it to Europe and pays a lot more from it, until it then says, no, I'm going to buy it from America because it's slightly cheaper. And then Trump has a policy of trying to drive down the prices, which will support China, but it's a retreat economy and all the knock-on effects as well. So India currently buys all of its oil and gas from Russia, Saudi, and Iraq, but now it's going to be buying from America as a result of these tariffs, which is, again, the narrative that America is moving from a regional power with military bases in Asia to a regional power and bringing the troops home to avoid World War III and all the problems that could come from that. So at the same time, we got a little bit of a contradiction. You have to have some posturing, which is that Trump says anyone that does de-dollarization by supporting BRICS is going to get 100% tariffs. Who's a member of BRICS? India, China, Russia, South Africa, Iran, Egypt, Brazil, Ethiopia, and the many, many more applications that are happening right now. So again, posturing. And what is the posturing? It's, we're strong. You're going to get 100% tariff, and you're going to start trading with China instead, and BRICS, and you're going to start trading with each other so that we can weaken the dollar and more trades can happen outside of the dollar, so that we can retreat and stop sending you money because we can't afford to send you any money. So we have to expose that the money is all corrupt, and we have to make you look corrupt and just focus on your things and pretend that we're the moral high ground people. That's what's happening on the macro environment right now. And so anyone that is working with BRICS is going to get that threat, which will lead to the aid being pulled, and America being America first and regional power. So let me take a little bit of a water break. Now, which of the companies benefit from this new model? Well, of course, it's the AI warfare military industrial complex led by Palantir. Palantir, that is creating the technology for the IDF, that is committing genocide as a service, as a beta, that is also funding to all these regimes that America pretends it's exporting democracy to, that maintains that power through artificial intelligence. And who was behind that? The other co-founder of the CIA operations and technocrats that came from Larry Summers and Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, who is the beneficiary of Palantir, whose number one client is government, AI warfare. And so Peter Thiel, Larry Summers, is it Saunders or Summers? Why am I getting confused? Correct me in the comments which one I'm getting that wrong. And Elon Musk are going to be the technocrats that get the stable coins, that work with World Liberty Financial, and it's going to be powered by a new proof of weapons network, which is where troops don't need to fight, machines fight, using the artificial intelligence. So now Palantir on the US stock market is trading at 60 times revenue, because all the corrupt funny money is buying the stock that's coming back in as you bribe the government, and you get this pushing of the war, and now you get a switch of the narrative. And who's going to be the benefit? Palantir, which does contracts with Israeli military industrial complex companies like CrowdCheck, you know, the ones that led to the assassinations that we're no longer focusing on. Remember the assassinations in OpenAI that didn't make the mainstream because the organizations are paying the media in order to not cover those stories, as was shown in the USAID scandal. So the PayPal mafia are dominating Israel's technology, America's military industrial complex, and Israel is two-siding it with China and America. And then you've got these large globalist organizations like Palantir that sells to governments all around the world, as we have this slow transition. And of course, X is going to be the artificial intelligence platform that gets all the data. And there's no fighting it, because we'd rather have freedom of speech, take away our freedom of reach. And we'd rather have the exposure of the corruption that's gaslighting us and calling us all conspiracy theories, when anyone that follows the money knows that it's 100% true as well. So Palantir is beta testing all the AI warfare in the worst genocide that is going to be rebuilt by Trump. So we got the Trump narrative as well. Now, I don't believe that's going to happen, and I'll cover more about that in the geopolitics section. But essentially, there was a narrative that America will be pulling out of NATO, which I hope it does, because it's one big money laundering operation that controls media in order to make you think you're exporting democracy. But NATO said that everyone needs to, based upon America's principles, needs to move from those that were trying to get to 2% spending on Palantir and Boeing and all of the General Dynamic and all the military industrial complex stocks. They have to spend more and more of your GDP. So not only are you getting tariffs, not only are you getting covert regime change operations, not only are we implanting the person that's going to be using AI for mega and giving us all the European data, you're also going to be spending all of your money on our military industrial complex contractors. This is the pillaging of Europe if it continues down its America first policy. And so they said you need to go up to 5%. To put that in context, America would need to spend $1.4 trillion to meet that quota. That is more. There is $1 trillion of interest in debt. Remember where I said, if you want to tackle the deficit, it's war, it's interest, it's Medicare, it's Social Security. What is Medicare and Social Security? A racket for BlackRock and the service industry in Wall Street to charge you fees on your money. And now they're trying to charge you money on your Bitcoin with these ETFs as well to save the pension Ponzi scheme as these demographic warfares happen and we enter into this new retreating economy to a regional superpower. Anyway, they want Europe to go to 5% spend. That will bankrupt Europe. How do they justify it? Well, we created this proxy war between US and Russia, which WikiLeaks told us and leaked all the emails that this was a multi-decade operation and that Russia did want to join NATO and Europe was meant to align with Russia, but America wanted to engage in this financial terrorism involving the European Central Bank and a globalist agenda. But yeah, it won't happen. You can't have $1.4 trillion while trying to decrease your deficit. So hopefully that leads to the model of what we saw in USAID. America say we're not spending 1.4%. How are they going to justify it? Sorry, 1.4 trillion. How are they going to justify it? NATO is corrupt. So now let's end the war with Ukraine. We're going to negotiate getting all of the land. We're going to try and get some of our rare earths, even though Russia has already cornered that part. But we'll go now, and Putin, rather than demifying Putin, we're going to say actually he did want peace, and he's a power, and he's got more nukes than us. And so now you're seeing a change in narrative, which is why Trump was implanted in order to fulfill that agenda as well, which is why if you look back at previous episodes, I was able to tell you with precision exactly who was going to get elected, how it was going to happen, because I followed the money rather than following the narratives. Anyway, we know we are in that trade war when Trump starts looking at the tariffs within Europe, and that's going to be combined, I believe, with the peace negotiations between Russia, because Russia won and America got what it wanted. And unfortunately, the Ukrainians were the sacrificial lamb of the military industrial complex. And now we get the truth where, after the Biden administration saying to us, no, the IDF are targeting, they wouldn't blow up hospitals. They wouldn't dare target citizens. They wouldn't kill people. They're after it's just human shields. And now Trump tells the truth, that there's a humanitarian crisis, the whole thing's demolished. And now he starts to tell the truth that many Ukrainians have been killed as a result of this. And Trump wanted, and Putin wanted peace all along. And then they do USAID, which tells us how the media was spent as well. Anyway, this is bankrupting euro in order to protect the dollar. And our European politicians may be too dumb, because who do they get paid by? The Israeli lobby, the European Central Bank, the military industrial complex, the bank lobby, the big pharma lobby, which is why no one's focusing on Europeans, and all the money goes back into the euro dollar system. Okay. So as a result of that, there was an announcement that CPI, which is the measure of inflation that doesn't discount for the fact that the dollar is strengthening. So people feel broke and it feels like inflation's okay. And remember, this is cumulative upon a price that nobody could afford anyway. But you've now got 3% inflation at the same time as you cutting rates prior to the Trump administration in order to have the perfect setup of Operation Choke Point 2.0 on Trump, where if Trump wants to come against the Fed can hike rates in order to, because it's got this inflationary environment, and it can fully justify it and can wipe out the banking system and transition to a CBDC or a stable coin and have full power over as we get that battle, which is why the Bitcoin strategic reserves for Treasury become higher and more important as a national security thing. And so we now are saying that inflation needs to be 3%. And they cut rates, even though it's gone from 2.4%, cut rates. 2.6%, cut rates. 2.9%, hold rates. 3% hold rates. So this is, systemic inflation that is expected into the system, and the Fed having the tool that it needs if it wants to wipe out the proof of weapons network and replace it with a CBDC, which is saying that it won't, or it's got its globalist policy and it can go through a non-America first if it chooses, because who are its shareholders? The banks, and they meet every period. Okay, so this is why we're having a corresponding deflationary force, which is a push for artificial intelligence, which leads to unemployment eventually, I think. But all roads lead to inflation with the exception of a few industries. So some people are telling you that tariffs aren't inflationary, which is an element of truth. You can offset it with a weakening currency and build your manufacturing base, which is the transition we'll experience. But then rate cuts can offset that as well. And replacing illegal immigration with legal immigration and immigration reform is inflationary. And make America healthy again. That's inflationary, because healthy means more expensive food, because because you're not poisoning everyone with chemicals again. Isolationism, inflationary. And remember, inflation is exported globally because America gets the lowest inflation with all the ones that are on the Bank for International Settlements and IMF proof of weapons network, with the exception of those outside the system like China and various other regions. So RFK was sworn in. RFK is going to take on the big pharma, look for the reaction in big pharma stocks, and we shall see what happens as a result of that. But at the same time, we now have the USAID model. Now, a pro-Zionist is going to be in charge of doing the exposures, just like we saw with USAID. And Mossad operations and CIA deep state operations like JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, COVID, the bio wars, 9/11, the Epstein files, they're all going to be revealed, apparently. And we know what's in them already, but at least we get the confirmation. I hope it goes the same as USAID, but can we really rely upon a pro-Zionist that may have a dual Israel first, America first mandate, as she has all her photos with Netanyahu and everything? Can we really rely on them to expose Mossad, just like we saw in Hollywood when they blamed JFK on the CIA rather than Mossad, even though it was a joint operation? Do we get more of the same? I think so. This is going to be saying this is all the Democrats. So I'm okay with that, but we need to stay one step ahead and follow the money and recognize that, because that is the key to not going down the World War III path. Because the World War III path involves America being tricked through fake war and terror 2.0 into the Middle East in order to occupy Gaza so it can escalate to a war with Iran, who has 100 million, a military industrial complex, a base with all those drones, and will lead to a massive forever war, ginormous escalation. And Iran has already signed an agreement with Russia, a 20-year security agreement, and Russia is needed for China's oil supplies. And so you enter into the path that Israel could take us down rather than the policy of retreating, if you don't get control of the fact that there is a massive pro-Zionist policy and Israel first policy is not in line with America first policy, as I can read the trees. So remember to follow the money, not listen to the narrative. And so I hope, and I will keep reporting as these exposures happen so people can stay ahead and make sure they're protecting yourself. But you can always opt out with Bitcoin as well. And hopefully you have been doing that every month, as I've been asking people and sharing with people to do ever since I did my first video at the first Bitcoin conference in 2011 and published the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin. Remember, you can get all of that at BitcoinHardTalk membership portal for absolutely free. Head over to simondixon.com, hit the yellow button, and you can get a free login. And then we can make sure you're ahead of this And if YouTube bans all our videos or X bans all our videos because they don't like our message, then at least you can get them through the membership portal as well. And help me get to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. I need that blue check so that I can actually stop the censorship that's happening right now, as I've been shadow banned ever since I covered the more geopolitically controversial things. Anyway, so what are the key deflationary forces? Well, unemployment. And what's happening with Doge? Doge is going to do mass unemployment from the government, as it should, as it needs to do. Artificial intelligence is going to eventually lead to large numbers of unemployment. And if you can really increase the supply of oil and gas by working with Saudi Arabia, which is why that region becomes so important, then you can decrease the price of oil and gas. And that can be a deflationary force, but there's the side effect. The frackers, the oil companies, can't manufacture at that rate. So that destroys the internal American base of its own resources, and OPEC can. And so that's why there's a deal that becomes increasingly important to Saudi Arabia that we'll be covering more in the geopolitical section as well. And so tariffs, relationships, follow the money, don't follow the words. And essentially, this is America moving to a regional superpower rather than being a global hegemony with all these covert wars that prop up the dollar. Okay. So deflation through rising unemployment, and that kind of ties into the stablecoin narrative or the CBDC narrative we need to be aware of, because you can program universal basic income, negative interest rates, which will come after the monetary reform, which requires an attack on fractional reserve banking, an end the Fed, or a replacement of the Fed with a CBDC. Many different directions this can go, but reducing the government burden can only lead to more unemployment. So essentially, the only way to navigate this is to ditch the proof of weapons network, which leads to more peace. More peace leads to more power for other regions and other blocks because the scam is revealed. And you can protect yourself with peaceful proof of work, which is Bitcoin. And any country that wants to protect themselves can front run the transition as more and more stack their Bitcoin anyway. What else did we get in the macro side? So Jerome Powell had the Senate hearing. Powell said that quantitative easing would only be used if in a situation where rates were 0% again. Okay, so that means he's saying you won't see quantitative easing, which means a new tool needs to be used if it is needed. And that was also combined with a narrative of no CBDC, which implies the AI technocratic stablecoin version instead, more favoring over to that model. We shall see, and we'll watch that battle. But by the public statements, no QE unless we go to a zero interest rate environment. The problem is that obviously the proof of weapons network makes houses unaffordable. That's the side effect, because the banks always prop the digital currency that they create into mortgages. Mortgages prop up the real estate market, and that makes people's wages are not increasing at the same way. It creates wealth inequality and no ability to get onto the property ladder, particularly for those that were born in the wrong side of the proof of weapons network, while the boomers benefit from it and the younger people don't. And so Trump wants to get rates down as a macro policy for a couple of reasons. He's got a massive real estate portfolio, and he wants to be able to show that he can take on the Fed by doing the 10-year treasury rates down, because you need to refinance all of the government debt. So how do you get that deficit down? Remember, there is no way to pay off the government debt. You need to refinancing it. So a massive chunk of US debt is going to become due, and they roll it over in the Ponzi scheme by finding new buyers for that debt. How do you find new buyers for that debt? You pay a higher interest rate. How do you find new buyers? You have a stable coin that backs it if you want to pay a lower rate. So you can have a policy of lowering rate and backing your currency through stable coins that then can be used in order to buy those treasuries. But during the refinance, you need to get those interest rates down. So Trump is frantically trying to either get Jerome Powell to put rates down or do it through other type of forces as well. And how much is there? There is $14 trillion worth of debt that needs to be refinanced within the next 3 years. This means that all current interest rate levels, at the current interest rate levels, which is approximately 5.25%, it would cost an additional $300 billion to service it if you refinanced at these rates, which is why Trump needs to get interest rates down, and he needs to do it fast. The LA crisis, which happens at the tail end, is another problem because now it's getting harder to have insurance on housing. And so instead, because you can't insure it, the only people that can buy housing are people that can buy it outright. And so in LA, you can only buy a house outright because people don't want to insure anymore, which favors those that have cash flow, which means that, again, more wealth inequality, more problems as a result of that, which is making it harder to get rates down and achieve the refinancing that is needed. So interest payments out. So where can you save? War. How do you save in war? Expose the scheme for what it is, USAID exposure, and then you can retreat. And the cost is you have global powers in other regions, and we can move to peace in order to spend less on war. And that is why I think I'm following the money, and that's where I think we're moving to. But there is a competing force which wants war that we need to be aware of, that we'll cover in the geopolitical section. Another interesting thing is you can use real estate. So rather than having real estate, the young people can buy Bitcoin every month, and you can change your time preferences. So rather than buying real estate, you can save that money and you can buy Bitcoin. You can buy Bitcoin every month. And historically, it has outperformed real estate. And if you outperform it, then you may be able to buy the real estate outright, as was the case for me when I started buying Bitcoin at $3 in 2011 and said a simple policy: I need more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, which means that I need to spend less than I earn and save the difference in Bitcoin, which means that I need to restructure some of my debt and make sure that I invest and save in Bitcoin first. And ever since I did that, I beat the hell out of the proof of weapons network. And so was everyone else that I shared that strategy with ever since. But anyway, you could rent and you could save in Bitcoin. And I'm not saying that will work, not financial advice, but as a young person, that strategy has worked as well. Now, what other announcements are we seeing? Now, remember, we got this whole announcement around America having a sovereign wealth fund. Again, that ties into the narrative. If you're decreasing the deficit, you'll have a contraction in GDP. So therefore, you need a monetary reform, which ties into needing a Bitcoin strategic reserve. These things are incredibly complex, which ties into the tariff narrative. And then you need partnerships with the countries that have all the sovereign wealth. And so Saudi Arabia announced that it's going to be investing $1.5 billion in artificial intelligence. And Trump's son-in-law, Kushner, has a deal that had all the investment from Saudi to invest in real estate in the Middle East, hence the announcement about Trump saying we're going to take over Gaza and I'm going to own it. It didn't say America's going to own it. It said America initially, says I'm going to own it. And so this narrative, I'll cover that more as well. But with US running a trade deficit, the desire for worldwide sovereign wealth funds invested in America will be needed to have a Bitcoin strategic reserve in America's own sovereign wealth fund. But where are the funds going to come from? So I covered a lot of this last week, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper into this week. So I looked at the largest sovereign wealth funds to understand, how can this be done? Have we got any test case for a world reserve currency retreating? Well, we got the British Empire retreatment, but there was another power to hand it over to, which was America. America doesn't have another power to hand it over to. So this is unprecedented. And we've never had a fiat currency, which was created in 71 when America defaulted and said you can't convert the Federal Reserve proof of weapons network into gold. And instead, the Fed ended up with the gold rather than Treasury, which is why the audit comes through. And I hope we get to learn the truth. But which countries have successfully run surpluses? And maybe there is a two-tiered strategy, which leads me to the belief that Saudi is an important partner in everything moving forward. So let's have a look. So Norway, which is a large gas exporter and oil exporter, they have the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, 1.74 trillion. It was funded all by oil and gas revenues and trade surpluses. China has the second largest, $1.35 trillion, and it was funded by them being an exporter and having trade surpluses, by having a weakened currency, which is the strategy America wants to follow, so that it can build its manufacturing base, and then it had a surplus, and therefore it can have a sovereign wealth fund. UAE, Abu Dhabi, has $1.1 trillion sovereign wealth fund. That's funded revenues and surplus. Kuwait has $969 billion, oil and gas surplus. Saudi Arabia has $925 billion. Singapore has $847 billion, and another one which is $288 billion. But it had that through funding its surplus as well by becoming a global regional port that could charge tariffs on its geostrategically important location as America is transitioning to, hence Panama. And that was funded by a trade surplus. Who else? Qatar, $510 billion sovereign wealth fund. That's funded by natural gas exports. UAE Dubai, $360 billion, which is funded by, again, being a strategically important location and creating a tax-free environment that also had a pro-crypto policy that America is following right now. So where do I think the money for the very first country in the world that is retreating from world reserve currency, that is trying to transition into a monetary reform at the same time, that is building a sovereign wealth fund that has a ginormous trade deficit? It's the first we have ever seen that has a fiat currency with no convertibility into hard assets. I think Trump is doing a two-tiered economy, which is going to have a sovereign wealth fund with money from Saudi. And maybe the GCC, some of the other regions like UAE and Abu Dhabi. And so therefore, it needs its relationship with the GCC, the Gulf, the Gulf Corporation and State Cooperation, rather, more than it needs its relationship with Israel right now. And so that leads me to the tension between America first, Israel first, and the historic policy of funding the military-industrial complex by creating chaos in the Middle Eastern region, so the GCC could never reunify, that now has all of these sovereign wealth funds that America wants. As it builds AI, and they want to invest in that, and it wants to invest in China as well, as it can sit in the middle of the region, which is why MI5 and the Rothschild family did the Balfour Declaration, giving Palestine to the Zionists through Walt Rothschild in the first place to create a region of instability and create all the fake religious wars and everything else in between. So that need is no longer there, which leads me to be very hopeful, maybe deluded, but very hopeful. But is America Israel first, or is America Israel first right now? That's the relationship that we need to test, because that is what held up all this region. And I think the GCC that has all the money and sovereign wealth, and America that wants it in order to manage this transition into a surplus. And it's got Bitcoin and a crypto strategy. This is how I see it in the macro side all around right now. So I think this ties into having a solution to Iran and Israel, which is saying you can't be a nuke, but maybe you can join GCC. They got regime change. Remember, the helicopter fell. There's Israel was used in to take out the leadership in the different proxies in Hezbollah and various other regions. And so maybe, just maybe, I could be deluded, but maybe, just maybe, Israel can be controlled by the GCC. We can have a two-state solution, and we can actually have real peace, because that model's dead, which is why I think it's very important that we get the revelations from JFK, 9/11, Epstein, so that the intelligence, Mossad, and CIA operations can be revealed to everyday Americans, just as they are discovering right now that ISIS was a Mossad operation and Al-Qaeda was a CIA operation. And that brings me to how to manage this transition into multipolarity from the macro side. So that's everything I've got for you on the macro side. We're now going to move over to part 3, where we tie all this together on the Bitcoin side and the macro side into the geopolitical side. And so I'm going to do me a favor. I need to get to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell symbol, hit all, because YouTube ain't giving us anything until we get to 100,000. And we used to have growth, and suddenly, as soon as I started revealing all these things, they wouldn't show our content to anyone. So I completely rely upon you, and I'll publish to X and Rumble. Please subscribe to me, follow me on Rumble. I got a tiny little following. But if this gets wiped out because they don't like my content, I'm going to have to transition to Rumble, and also follow me on X, and also join the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, because if all of that fails, I'm going to need a self-hosted environment. And I want to continue making sure this message gets to as many people as possible, no matter what happens with the algorithm. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick water break, and then we're going to move into the geopolitics section for this week in geopolitics.